Let's talk about fascism. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to a discussion which I think, is necessary. I'm sure other people have done it and maybe done it better than me, but which I just feel like I have to address this issue of what is fascism, because, we increasingly see the term thrown around and other terms related to fascism thrown around, and, how effective that is, I think depends on the amount of knowledge people have about what fascism is. So let me start off with a really basic definition of fascism. Fascism is an ultra-nationalist form of authoritarianism. Okay, so authoritarians seek to gain all power for themselves. This can be a political party, this can be an individual, it can be a group of individuals, but authoritarians seek to gain all political power for themselves. Now, in any authoritarian system, this means that the rights of the people no longer really exist, because the leaders can do whatever they want to. They have that power. They have that authority. You have fascist authoritarian governments. You have communist authoritarian governments. You have religious authoritarian governments. You can have all different kinds of authoritarian governments. What they all have in common is that all the power, all the political power belongs to this leading group or this one individual leader. What separates fascism from religious authoritarianism or communist authoritarianism is this idea of ultranationalism. This is how we get to the point where the society willingly, unwillingly decides to invest one person or a small group with all this power. And with fascism, it comes from ultranationalism, this kind of super revved up, destructive form of patriotism, which basically says that our nation is great, and it's so great we shouldn't have to follow the rules. We are the exception to the rule because we are that great. Okay, that's the kind of ultranationalism we are talking about. That's what fascism is really all about. So fascist political parties, movements don't attempt to replace the symbols of the nation. They attempt to co-opt the symbols of the nation. They don't want to destroy the old system. We think about Mao or Lenin, Stalin destroying the old kind of czarist system and all its symbols and things like that. Fascists don't want to do that. They want to hold up those old symbols because those to them are symbols of past greatness. And that's one of the things that they're really kind of honing in on. So what separates fascism from the other forms of authoritarianism is this kind of ultra-nationalism, this kind of patriotism gone wrong, which also then requires absolute loyalty on the part of the people. If the nation is great and is intended to be great, and we have this leader who's going to make it great, then everyone should be loyal to that leader and that system. And if they're not, they are preventing greatness. And therefore, fascist governments rely on or depend on or demand absolute loyalty. So we talk about fascist systems or fascist governments in the history of the world. There have been at various points in history governments which might qualify as fascist, but most of us think about the World War II period of time, and so that's really what I'm going to focus on, because I think that's the one that's most familiar. That really is when fascism began with Mussolini in Italy. And so those are the three systems that the Allies fought, three governments the Allies fought in World War II, which I'm going to look at as fascist. Now, right away, a lot of people are going to kind of bridle the idea that Japan had a fascist system of government, and it's true. The Japanese never elected a fascist political party. They maintained the system of government they had before, but the Japanese government was increasingly ultranationalist, led by a party which promoted military solutions to their problems, which promoted this idea of Japanese superiority, and they used the emperor as a symbol of Japanese greatness and to demand loyalty from the Japanese people. And so we kind of arrive at a fascist-type system. The first fascist government in history would be Mussolini's government in Italy, when he and his fascist party took over and more or less took control of the government of Italy with the, essentially the blessing of the, ruling powers in Italy before, and he absorbs more and more power to himself. And then most famously, we know that Hitler rose to power by creating the Nazi Party based on Mussolini's kind of blueprint, and was able to get Nazis elected, get himself appointed chancellor, and then seized absolute power by staging a crisis event which allowed him to invoke martial law. those are the three kind of fascist systems that I'm looking at and drawing my examples from. So there are a few things that I think are characteristics of all fascist systems of government. One is all fascist systems of government are organized around a charismatic leader, whether that's Franco in Spain or Mussolini in Italy or Hitler in Germany. They are formed around a charismatic leader. Whatever it is, oftentimes I think when we look at these people like Hitler or Mussolini, we see these people, and they, to us, and even at the time period in the United States of America, they appeared to be jokes. They seemed to be cartoonish and laughable. They, looked odd. Their appearance was odd. Their behavior was odd. They seemed to be, somewhat irrational and perhaps a little bit crazy. And so, Americans and people around the world made fun of Mussolini and Hitler up until the point at which you can no longer make fun of them. But, these charismatic leaders, for whatever reason, are able to gain loyalty of an ever-growing group of people. Okay, so this is where their power comes from. Now, a lot of times, in the case of both Mussolini and Hitler, they began as, members of a socialist political party. And so a lot of times we see people tell us that, that Hitler was left-wing and he was a socialist, and, Nazi is a amalgamation of National Socialists. And so people assume that Hitler was, in fact, a socialist. He was not. He used that party and that vehicle to gain power, because what fascist leaders are all about is power. They're not following an ideology other than the ideology of power and nationalism. They don't have goals. They don't have economic goals. They don't have, a written set of philosophy that they're following. So neither Mussolini or Hitler end up being socialists, even though they started off their political careers as part of socialist movements. So, that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind. You don't have to have been a fascist from the very beginning. You can become fascist over time. And in both cases, that's what we have. So a second characteristic of all fascist systems, all fascist governments, is they all seek to divide their populace into desirable people and undesirable people, into the real Germans, the true Italians, and the other. And that other group really is flexible depending on the political reality on the ground at the time. So, Mussolini's first kind of other group he went after were communists, but then he went after all these other political groups. He's essentially eliminating political rivals for power so that only he and his organization have power. This is true for Hitler in Germany as well. That he goes around eliminating political rivals and focusing his attention on these other groups, like Jewish people, like members of the LGBTQ plus community, like people who suffered from mental health issues, and he others them. And he essentially says, okay, these are the good Germans. The good Germans are like this, and the bad Germans are like this. And so what he wants to do is to not even have the bad Germans be considered Germans. He wants to take away their rights. He wants to, other them. So this other group can include ethnic groups, religious groups, political groups, LGBTQ plus groups. It can be immigrants. It can be, political organization. Whatever the leader says the other is, that's who the other is, and that's who it becomes. So we see oftentimes in these fascist systems, the other group moves and changes a lot over time. So another common characteristic that all these have, that all the fascist nations have in common, is this idea that the leader, this charismatic leader, is the one who knows how to, return the nation to its past glory. Think about Italy after World War I. Economy was destroyed, politically unstable. They had been on the side of the winners, but they hadn't really gained very much out of it. And this created a power vacuum in which Mussolini is able to slowly gain control. Think about Germany, defeated during World War I, forced to take responsibility, forced to pay reparations, which crippled the economy, and forced to adopt a government that the Allies created for it. And Hitler's able to, prey on those grievances that people had about what was happening to them and tell them, we are great. Germany is supposed to be great. Mussolini, Italy is supposed to be great. Japanese leaders, Japan is supposed to be great. And then use this idea that if we're not great, if we're not what we used to be, it's the fault of these people who are the other. It's the fault of the other that we aren't where we're supposed to be. And therefore, you see how this creates this pressure of eliminating this other group of people who are taking our jobs, who are, in the words of fascist leaders, poisoning the blood of the nation, who are committing crimes, who are immoral, who are whatever it is. They focus on this other and the idea that if we can eliminate the other, and I don't necessarily mean killing people, we eliminate the other by driving them out or by taking away their citizenship and taking away their rights, then we can return the nation to its past glory. So then eliminating this group who the fascist leader has othered, becomes the priority. And the leader says, you have to give me power so I can address this issue, so I can eliminate this other, so I can, get the morally degraded people out of society and, take away their rights, so I can get rid of these dangerous criminal elements who exist in society, and move them out of society. And you have to let me have power to do this. And yes, that power may mean that, I'm going outside the law and the actual legal system, and I'm pushing the barriers of that, and I am taking away rights of people. But you have to let me do that, because if you don't, we won't return to our past glory. We won't be what we should be. And this then creates this kind of loyalty question. And it creates really, I think, one of the key hallmarks of understanding how fascism works, that this leader becomes invested with all this power. This leader is seen as the person who can solve the problem, who understands the problem, who has identified the problem, and therefore anyone who opposes that leader is also a part of the problem and must be also eliminated. Those groups have to be designated as dangerous groups. Who have to be eliminated. And if it's the media has to be curtailed and brought to heel and brought under control. That these other groups, if they're not completely loyal to the leader, then they're disloyal to the nation. One of the final stages of fascism, a fascist movement, is equating the leader to the nation, so that an attack, let's just say a political attack, not a violent attack, on the leader is an attack on the nation. That those two things in the minds of people who support these leaders have become the same thing. And that's an incredibly dangerous moment to be in. So to solve this problem, to solve the problem of the other, all fascist movements, whether it's Mussolini in the black shirts, Hitler with the brown shirts, the Gestapo, whatever, all of them create some kind of internal police force which answers only to the leader. The Gestapo really only answers to Hitler. They do what Hitler says, regardless of what the law is. These groups are willing to break the law because to them, the power of the leader is what's important. And if no one stands in their way, if no one stops them, then they're going to continue to abuse the rights of people, and they're going to continue to do whatever the leader says, which is a real threat then to democracy and a key part of this kind of fascist system. So the leader creates this kind of independent political police force, which only he controls. At the same time, he seeks to control the military. He wants more and more control over the military. Famously, Hitler, before he moved forward to really establish martial law, he made sure that he had the generals who were in charge of the German army swear loyalty to him. And he changed, the oath you took when you joined the German army to swearing loyalty to Hitler. Again, keep in mind, in the view of the minds of fascists, there's no difference between those two things, because they want the military on their side, because that, oftentimes is the ultimate power in these places. They also want the wealthy on their side. And this is an important thing I think that we underestimate. Hitler may have started off thinking socialist thoughts, but once he saw the path to power, he realized that the only people who could stand in his way were the wealthy and powerful in the military. And he needed the wealthy and powerful on his side. So he met with the wealthy and powerful, the industrialists, and he made them believe that not only would everything be okay if he got power, but they would actually make money from it. And they eventually signed on to that, much to their regret. They eventually signed on to that. So you oftentimes see these kind of fascist political leaders meeting with, taking presents from, making concessions to these powerful economic leaders in their country as a way of solidifying their base of power as well. So kind of other minor things, they almost all have some kind of symbolic language or symbols which which their members use to identify themselves as members of the group. The swastika for the Germans, black shirts for the Italians. They have these kind of things, symbols that they that they wear. They have phrases they repeat. They have language that is insider language that makes them feel makes people who join or who are loyal to the group feel more important and more powerful within that group. There's usually that symbolic aspect to it as well. And then obviously, I think the end point is that all these people, all these fascist leaders, talk about staying in power. They can't contemplate the idea of not being in power. So regardless of what the law says about how long they can be in power, they start talking about staying in power, almost immediately, and talking about ways around the rules or changing the rules. And their supporters are all about this because remember, the supporters believe this fascist leader is the one who can solve the problem. And the problem is the other, and if we eliminate the other, we can get back to the glory we had in the past. That's how fascism works. That's how fascism is ultranational. And those are things I think we can all look for when identifying, fascism and fascist nations. Anyway, there you go. There is my discussion on fascism. Look forward to your comments in the comment section below. And as always, thank you for watching.